So this exercise is a 2-point perspective exercise. Now, if you've listened to my other videos, the overview and the 1-point perspective exercise, then you're definitely ready for this exercise, and I hope that you enjoy it. This is really meant to be a more intuitive way of learning 2-point perspective. So I hope that you'll follow along and make up your own interpretations of the exercise too. So I'm drawing squares mainly for these exercises, but if you feel like you are already there with this method, then throw in other shapes and push the exercise. Don't be restricted by what I'm telling you. If you feel like you want to just push further and play more with it, please do that. And if you can, share it with me as well, because I'd love to see what you all come up with. Okay, have fun. As with the last 1-point perspective exercise, I'm going to give you a really brief overview of the whole exercise in time-lapse, and then I'm going to break it down in real time so you can follow along. Essentially, this exercise is again finishing with something quite complex when you look at the result, but actually the process is very simple and it's just a case of following each stage. As I mentioned, these exercises are designed to be more intuitive. What I mean by that is they're going to strip away a lot of the technical terminology, and instead I want you to follow me visually. The composition we're going to be drawing consists of lots of forms. The repetitive nature of the exercise will really help you learn, whilst the composition itself will help you learn how the angles of the forms change depending on their position to the viewer. We'll also be covering line weight and its effects because it's really important with creating order. Finally, with this exercise we're going to be looking at hatching. In the 1-point perspective exercise we finish in the same way, but actually we're going to introduce some more challenging methods, including hatching in perspective and cross-hatching in perspective. The pens we're using in this exercise are the same pens that I use in the exercise for the 1-point perspective. They can be found in the description. As with the previous exercise, and actually most of the exercises in the series, I'm going to be drawing a reference cube to begin with. I'm going to use this to help explain the main principles of the different methods of perspective. In this case, we're looking at a 2-point perspective. The first figure represents the face-on view typically used for a 1-point perspective. The second figure represents a more skewed view to the cube. 1-point perspective wouldn't be suitable for capturing this view. This would be a 2-point perspective view that would best capture it. This is what we're going to be focusing on in this exercise. If you've had a look at the overview where I discussed the benefits of learning the different methods of linear perspective, you'll know that the 2-point perspective method enables us to change the horizontal angle of the direction of sight, which in turn means that we can move around the form and capture it from any angle. Whereas in a 1-point perspective exercise, only one parallel set of lines were leading away from the viewer, in 2-point perspective, 2 sets of parallel lines are leading away from us. In this scenario, it's both sets of horizontal parallel lines. What's really important to remember is that because the vertical set of parallel lines are not leading away from us, they will stay vertical. So throughout this exercise, the vertical lines will always be vertical, and that's one constant that will really help us. For this exercise you'll need 3 different line weights, but if you're using pencil you can just apply different pressures. The harder the pressure, the thicker the line weight. So to begin with, I want you to draw in your horizon line. I'll be using the finest line weight. Next we'll need to draw in the 2 vanishing points. As our direction of sight is skewed to the faces of the cube, we have 2 horizontal sets of parallel lines leading away from us. One set of parallel lines will be leading to the left vanishing point, and the perpendicular set of parallel lines will be leading to the other vanishing point. The first part of the cube we'll be drawing is the front corner. So draw in a vertical line halfway between the 2 vanishing points. Now draw in construction lines from the top and bottom of this vertical line, leading towards the vanishing points. So after you've drawn your vertical line and the construction lines leading to the vanishing points, you can go ahead and finish one face of your cube. So draw a vertical line connecting the construction lines to the right of the initial vertical line. Again, I'll stress the importance of the vertical set of parallel lines remaining vertical. This is a constant and this will keep helping us throughout the exercise. Feel free to draft in a few faint vertical lines to help remind you of this. With that face complete, you can draw construction lines either from the vanishing point to the 2 remaining corners, or from the 2 remaining corners towards the vanishing point. Now drawing a vertical line to the left of the original vertical. This will be the left face you'll be completing. Again, draw construction lines between the two far corners of that face and the vanishing point. For the fourth and final vertical line, find the point where the construction lines intersect and connect these intersections with a vertical line. If it's not very clear on this first form, don't worry, because we'll be repeating the process lots for this exercise, and by the end of it you should feel very confident. Okay, so let's draw in some more forms now, again starting with a vertical line. As we did before, draw construction lines back to the vanishing points. Throughout the exercise, you'll be tempted to turn your page to make it more comfortable for your lines. Try not to do this, as it will help you develop your drafting ability. You will notice that certain angles feel more comfortable to draw, but the exercise is really about improving, so practice those weaker, more awkward angles. The second form we're drawing in is way above the horizon line, meaning the viewer's position is below the cube itself. Again, once you have one face of the cube complete, use the construction lines to connect the vanishing point with all four corners. This exercise is about learning, so don't stress about imperfections and mistakes. I'll go on to make a couple of mistakes where I'll explain why they're actually quite useful. The 1-point perspective exercise has two constants. The horizontals remained horizontal and the verticals all remained vertical. In the 2-point perspective exercise we only have one constant, and that's the verticals as discussed. The third form will be placed below the horizon line, as though we are positioned above the cube. Now this is the same process repeated, so you draw in your vertical line, draw construction lines back to the vanishing point, complete one face, then you draw construction lines back from all four corners of that one face. Draw in another vertical, completing a second face. More construction lines back to the vanishing point. Then the fourth and final vertical will join the intersections of those rear construction lines. It always sounds a little bit complicated when you're just kind of running through that verbally, but try and look at what I'm actually doing visually, and I think by the end of the exercise you'll definitely have a full understanding of 2-point perspective. Because the exercise is aimed at improving your perspective ability, it's important to remember the marks we are making are all representative of a position in space. Not only do we have to be aware of what's happening kind of visually just on this composition, but really try and connect with what these shapes represent in terms of their position to the viewer. So if they're above the horizon line, they're obviously higher than the viewer. If they're below, then they're lower than the viewer. Again, if they're over to the right, then to the right of the viewer, over to the left of the viewer. So you get the idea. I think it's really important to emphasize that they're not just shapes on a page, they are forms in 3 dimensions. So now you've drawn these 3 forms, you're probably feeling more confident with the 2-point perspective method. Let's build on that through drawing more forms in varying positions. So for the next step, I want you to draw just the vertical lines at random. Next, I want you to complete the process as shown. The idea of this is just to have one face of each of the forms before we go on to complete the whole form itself. I'm starting to feel like I've run through the process verbally enough, so I'll go ahead, draw it in real time, and you can just follow along and follow my lead. Don't feel like you have to follow my exact drawing. The beauty of knowing the process is that you can make it your own. As you can see, the forms I'm drawing vary quite dramatically in proportion, so don't be afraid to kind of play around with shallow shapes and deeper forms. It's really just a case of understanding this perspective method. So I want you to carry on drawing these forms, making the entire composition more and more complex. Each time you repeat the process, the more natural and instinctive it will become. So here I've spotted a mistake. As I said before, mistakes are nothing to be kind of scared of. They're actually really useful. So from correcting the mistake, I'll learn from it and I'll be less likely to make it in the future. So you might have spotted that the angle of this top edge doesn't lead directly to the vanishing point on the right hand side. So this needs to be corrected. I'm using the pen itself to show that if you follow the angle of the line, it hits the horizon just to the left of the vanishing point. So I'll just go ahead and change the angle so that it does hit true to the vanishing point. This doesn't look particularly pretty on the page, but it's just worth doing. When we add the thicker line weight, you won't actually see this mistake, but it's always worth noting the mistakes and trying to correct them rather than just kind of ignoring them for the sake of keeping the drawing neat. Now we can see that the composition is actually getting fairly complex, but this isn't a bad thing. So I want you to carry on adding volumes and forms around the existing composition to further add complexity. Once you feel like you've drawn enough forms, varying in size and position, it's probably time to move on to the next stage. So now with your thickest line weight, I want you to define the spatial edge of each form. As with the previous 1-point perspective exercise, this will add solidity and it will give the composition order. I'll start with the original cube. Because I've drawn around these forms in their entirety, we know that there's no form that sits between us and the form itself. With this form, we can see that the wireframe overlaps with the last. Because we've established that the last form is in front of this one, our thickest line weight must not cross its boundary. By using line weight only, we can dictate which forms are in front of the others. This example I'm drawing now is a clear example of the power of line weight. Going purely by the wireframe, you might expect that the larger form would be closer to us, i.e. in the foreground. But by drawing the spatial edge of the smaller form in its entirety, the larger form is then sent behind, and we can read the smaller form as being closer. For this part of the exercise, be careful to consider the form's relationship in the composition, or you could end up overlapping spatial edges. So here's another mistake. I've gone and drawn in a thick line on a planar corner. So I'm going to improvise and extrude from that form so it does in fact become the spatial edge. Like I said before, do not worry about mistakes. They always lead to a deeper understanding. So just embrace them and learn from them. So now we can look at the composition. What's going on visually here is the thickest line are gaining dominance over the thinner ones. That in itself is giving clarity to the composition because now we're making more of a considered decision in terms of their order in the overall composition, and we're showing that visually with the thicker line weight. Now with your middle line weight, I want you to draw in the visible planar corners. We want to give these dominance over the original construction lines, now the rear of the cube. For the next stage in this exercise, we're going to be focused on hatching, beginning with a vertical hatch for all right side facing planes. Don't worry about being neat, you're better off hatching past the line than just inside it. Now all the right side faces are hatched. I want you to hatch in the underside of the forms. Only this time I want you to hatch in perspective. This can take some getting used to, and it's a great way to improve your ability in finding the vanishing point more intuitively. You'll find that the existing construction lines leading to the vanishing points can come in quite handy here. So far, all the hatching has led to the right vanishing point. Now I want you to hatch the same underside face, but going to the other vanishing point. This will create a crosshatch in perspective, which will in turn darken the tone of the underside of these volumes. Okay, so that completes this 2-point perspective exercise. So if you're still here and you've managed to follow along this whole exercise in real time, then well done, because you've actually shown one of the most important traits needed to really improve your drawing, and that's patience and commitment. So I hope you carry on practicing with what you've learned in the series so far, and when you feel confident enough with the 1 and 2-point perspective exercise, you'll be ready for the 3-point perspective exercise. Thanks for all your comments and feedback so far, really appreciate them, and makes me feel a little less crazy for spending the hours editing. If you want, you can subscribe to keep following along with the series.